The Countdown is a YouTube program produced by Sapphire Aster Productions to interview guests on social, educational, sporting, and cultural issues affecting the Caribbean and the wider world.
Welcome to the Countdown. We will spend some time with Professor Dwayne Devonish, where we will talk about crime and violence in Barbados.
Thank you for joining us. Today we have Professor Dwayne Devonish, who is a professor of management and organizational behavior skill. Now let us learn a little bit more about him. Who is this man behind the title?
Okay, so I would consider myself to be a Black Rock man. I grew up in Black Rock with my grandmother, and I had, I believe, the lovely experience of seeing different sides of Black Rock. And this is Black Rock, St. Michael in Barbados. We had a mixture of young people coming from at-risk communities, single-parent households. I was raised by my grandmother, but I also used to go between my father and my grandmother.
Okay.
My mom, she was with me physically up to the age of 10, and she migrated to the US. And I had my issues in school. I was classified as the traditional underperformer.
Oh,
Yes, yes.
wow.
And I used to come home very late from school. I used to play in the arcades. In those days, in Bashal, in the Bashal area, there were many shops that carried arcades, these video game arcades. And I used to leave school at 2:30, 3 o'clock, go into these arcades and start playing and so on. So my grandmother got very upset. And at one point, she called the police and said that this young man is getting in after 8 p.m., after 9 p.m., almost every day, every
Wow.
school day.
That was
And I had,
scary.
yes, I had to change my behavior. But Dwayne Devonish, you asked the question, who's Dwayne Devonish? So Dwayne Devonish is someone I consider myself to be a lover of science, but also I have a passion for art. I consider myself to be generous, a kind individual. I believe that people should be able to speak their mind, and I want to do such.
Okay. All right. And in terms of your career, what were your aspirations?
Well, I mean, very young in secondary school, I had no aspirations, to be honest. And that's being very honest because, as I said, I was quite a chronic underperformer in secondary school.
Okay.
It was only when I reached sixth form that I started considering whether I should pursue technical vocational training or university education. And in the case of the farmer, I remember a principal told me, but you're not doing well. It might suit you best to go into technical vocational. So I had no foresight for university education. I used to tell people, and this is the honest truth, that I ended up at university by the skin of my teeth. I did A levels, and I got all E's in my A levels at secondary school. So when I got into university, it was really a surprise for me and perhaps to many of my friends and family members.
Wow.
But when I hit into the university environment, something clicked in me, and I started catching on concepts very organically. Things like statistics and even reading courses like psychology and sociology. I started to have a kind of intellectual appetite, and I started to understand things much better than I did when I was in secondary school. And from there, I think I grew into an intellectual, a very strong intellectual in between the ages of 18 and 20. At 21, I graduated with first class honors at the University of the West Indies Cape campus, and I secured a job at university as a research assistant at 21. So I was at university now for 20 years because I'm 41. Yeah.
Okay. So going back a little bit to the part where you were trying to figure out what you wanted to do, what was that aha moment to say that, well, yes, you will be a behavioral expert?
Well, when I started psychology, so I forgot to mention that I applied for psychology
Okay.
as my first option as an undergraduate degree at university, and I fell in love with psychology. I thought psychology helped me understand not just the behaviors and the mindsets of individuals, but of mine. All right, and I was able then to use that knowledge and that experience and exposure to psychology to even improve myself as an individual. And I said to myself at 21, I wanted to extend this particular discipline or this subject matter. And I, at 23, I applied for the Commonwealth Scholarship, the British Commonwealth Scholarship, to do a master's in work and organization psychology. Because during my psychology degree, my undergraduate psychology degree, I was able to uh, test subjects like management and business. So I was able to see a nice marriage between psychology and management, and how psychological interventions can be applied in the management context or the business environment. So my passion for this paradigm of psychology known as work psychology actually came in naturally, and I got the scholarship, and I was able to pursue an MSc in work and organization psychology at the University of Nottingham in the United Kingdom, and that was between the period of 2007 2008. Afterwards, I came back into the university system here in Barbados, KFO campus,
Okay. It
as a
was
lecturer.
okay. It was made mention that you were the youngest professor in the Caribbean. So what did that feel like?
Well, let me correct that. I am one of the youngest. Well, I am the youngest professor as it stands now. But in terms of the youngest person to ever achieve professorship, that's not true. I'm actually second youngest.
Okay.
The person that I can think about now is Professor Eddie Ventos, formerly of the law faculty. He was dean of law faculty. He got his at 35. I got mine at 30 at the age of 36 in 2020. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
But no, it was nevertheless it was a tremendous accomplishment in my estimation, and I was very proud of achieving that status.
Okay. As a behavioral expert, what would you say that is the main cause of the violence that we have now in Barbados?
Oh, whoa. We can't even reduce it as to a simple cause. When you look at the kind of criminal activity and violent expressions, especially coming out of our young men, young black men, this is something that has been evident for decades. But I believe it's reaching a particular crisis point, because if you think about it, a lot of the crime and violence is coming out of social, economic, and emotional turmoil. You know, I was reading an article in a particular on a particular platform in the U.S., and they were talking about black on black violence in the U.S. and so on, and they pinned it down that this particular phenomenon is a multifaceted one, not just multifaceted in its expression, but multifaceted in its causes. And I said, but this holds true for Barbados, because if you think about it, if you think about the profile of the perpetrator, the young male perpetrator, committing gang-related violence, gun-related violence, acquisitive crimes like burglary, theft, and robberies, you tend to see a profile where you have a young, very young, under the age of 21, if you look at the age of the perpetrator. Two, most of these young men have been early school dropouts. So they weren't able to successfully complete their education in the secondary school. So they left prematurely. Three, most of them are unemployed. And that's perhaps owed to the early dropout rate. So a lot of them left school, secondary school, without qualifications that would naturally allow them to be employable. Three, most of these young men are coming out of a community environment, which is plagued with violence. So they're seeing violence in the home, they're seeing violence in the community, their peers are committing violent action and criminal activity. So they're already surrounded, they're exposed chronically to a life of violence. So that's all they know in many respects. And you would see that the average young male perpetrator committing these crimes have had run-ins in the law at least 2, 3, or 4 times in their life. So it's a cocktail of causes. So you can't really pin it down to a specific cause.
The countdown will be back in a moment.
Welcome back to the countdown. Many years ago, we had grandparents who were, play a vital part in the grandchildren in raising them, giving them guidance and instruction and so on. And they had that firm, discipline on children. Do you think that that is also part, since you would find a lot of them now are working, they're not home, to give that firm discipline to children? You think that is part of the breakdown in society as well?
Well, it is interesting that you mentioned that, because it was only yesterday that I had the pleasure of delivering a session with a group of parents. We were looking at the reasons behind the rising crime in Barbados and looking at better ways of parenting our children. And somebody mentioned, growing up with an extended family structure. They had a grandparent, but had more. They had the two grandparents, and there was this village raising the child context. And I remember making the point, and this is a point I made in an earlier submission in a local radio program known as Brass Stats here in Barbados, that village raising child context has diminished because the cost of economic progression in any country effectively suggests that many of our younger people, younger adults, moved out of the those close-knit rural communities. So a lot of that disconnected families. So then you had people going into what we consider the heights and the terraces, and you set up these nuclear families where you have a parent, a mother and a father in the household, sometimes a single parent, and they have to work from 8 sometimes to 6 o'clock or 8 to 5 p.m. The child gets home before the parent. There may be someone there to take care of the child, but there's very limited supervision. So when we had that extended family structure, you could appreciate that we had kind of an extra coverage, okay, and an extra surveillance. I call it surveillance and not just surveillance, but it was a care system. You had an extended care system for the child. Now we don't have that, as you correctly highlighted too. Grandparents are much younger today than they were before. So we're getting younger people having children, and as a result, those children, as they mature, they're getting children even younger. So grandparents now are becoming younger. They're still active in the workforce. So then you have that limited supervision time. So I would say that yes, it plays a role, but I would want people to appreciate the fact that even with that change, because things change, things evolve in society, that the powers of the state have also extended, because you realize that people now are placing greater weight or burden on the school system or the government services to come in to help raise children in the absence of the village. So the village now has kind of morphed into the system, the state system itself. So, and you will see that in terms of across the sector, the government sector, in terms of the role of the child care board, okay, the role of probation, especially dealing with juveniles and so on, the role of other critical agencies that bring these services together to better care for the child. So I would say yes, it did play a kind of a minor role in what we're saying now.
I have observed that now more than ever, a lot of youngsters, both male and female, are playing violent video games. That what is your thought on that?
Okay, I'm a bit biased in that regard because I've done the research. There has been some evidence, only some evidence that there is a link between violent content, whether through movies, video gaming, and the perpetration of violence among adolescents or among young people. To be quite frank, I pretty much was an avid video gamer growing up. From as young as 10, and I'm talking about very violent video games. But in my life, going up through adolescence, even into young adulthood, I seldom experienced violent tendencies in that like part of my life cycle. So but that's anecdotal. But clearly, the evidence suggests that there has to be other things at play for violent media, whether it's through social media, whether it's through video gaming or TV, or even music, violent lyrics and so on, for those particular stimuli to affect in children or in young people violent or aggressive behavior. So let me give you a perfect example. In research, it would tell you that the link between the exposure to video game violence and violent behavior of children is not as straightforward as one would think. If you, however, add in things like the child who is being exposed to this violent video game experience is being raised by violent parents, for example, parents who may abuse them physically, or they come from an environment where they're seeing violence outside of the video game, what happens is a desensitization effect happens. Because here you have a child who's exposed to violence on the screen, but also exposed to violence in the physical environment that they're interfacing, whether it's in school, in the home, or the wider community. And the research would say it is under those types of conditions that you're likely to see that link established, what we call a mediation effect, not to be too technical. So in the research, it says that there are what we call intervening variables. These are variables that would exacerbate or strengthen, rather, the relationship between two other variables like exposure to violence, whether it be exposure to violence to media or video games or so on, and violent behavior. You have to have a cocktail in place. Cocktail meaning multiple variables all operating. Okay. Because you can have a situation where, like me, I came up in a very stable environment. I had exposure to violent TV. I had exposure to violent gaming. But I had no tendency or inclination to be violent in my behaviors.
Mm-hmm. But then there might just be in your instance or a few persons' instance, because some people, we are all different. So,
of course.
Yeah.
Well, things like psychological profiles would work in this case because there are, and that's something I think we probably can get to at some point. The fact that we still have to take into account when we think about perpetration of violent behavior, the hidden variable of mental illness is a big one. There were some studies done I think here in the local prison to demonstrate that those who were incarcerated had evidence of certain types of mental health disabilities, but there were also evidence of mental illnesses. So if you imagine then that you have a contingent, it could be a very small contingent of incarcerated individuals, whether men or women, who are serving a finite prison sentence. So at some point they'll be released or reintegrated back into society. The kind of rehabilitation that you need in prison, or that you usually meet in prison, devoid of psychiatric treatment, is going to be grossly insufficient for those individuals coming back out into society. Because effectively, how this should typically work, and I think on the books, and I imagine in practice it works, that the prison that we have would have to allow persons who are suspected of mental illnesses to be diagnosed formally through the powers of the psychiatric hospital. So through the service of the psychiatric hospital. So there has to be agencies talking with each other, so that a particular treatment plan can be developed. Because when that individual then is pushed back out into society, then we can argue that there's been a comprehensive regime of intervention and rehabilitation that has been put into place. But if you're using the traditional rehabilitation that you would give to someone who does not have a mental illness but is incarcerated, that's not going to work equally with the person that has an added situation,
Okay.
which we call the mental illness variable, the hidden variable there.
Okay.
Yeah. So well,
hence
we get into
so
interventions
hence
later.
the
Yeah.
statement you made with the cocktail is a mixture of
It's a cocktail.
different things.
Yeah. And you will hear people, whether it's brass stats or whether it's television program, everybody has the reason. Oh, the reason is because of this. Parents know, and those are reasons. But if you think about it, no reason exists in isolation.
Okay.
I can't say that person, like, okay, like we had in the same session that we had yesterday, somebody said, I believe that the reason is that parents drop the ball. Parents are derelict in their responsibility in raising strong and productive and positive children. And I said, but what about the situation where you have done everything you think you should? And let's say by best practice, as two parents, you did all you did according or consistent with best practice, but the child turns out still to be a violent or criminal crime-induced perpetrator. So who's at fault now? So what it means is that you can't go through what I consider to be a reductionist expression of causes. That the causes are reduced to these few things or this one thing. You have to kind of be broadened, much more broadened in your thinking to recognize. But there could be so many other things that create this cocktail.
Contribute.
All right, so you can't just go blame it on parents. And the same way you can't just blame it on the community or just blame it on school. It could be a cluster of other things that we've missed, or all of these things operating together or in tandem.
The countdown is brought to you with the compliments of Inaudi's Transport and Tours, reliability and convenience every ride. Black Diamond's Academy of Dance, shine bright like a diamond. Sarah Photos, capturing unforgettable moments. Karma Photo Booths, good vibes come around. EO Graphics, multimedia and design. Discover Digital, we take the worry out of web development. Estilo Executive Chauffeuring, style all the way. Evergreen Adventures, the exclusive choice. Miller's Entrepreneurial Services, let's connect. Celebration of life's journey, embracing 50. Sapphire Aster Productions, producing engaging content for the world.
Stay tuned for part 2 of this episode.
But the school, because the school is part of government, the school has to depend on government's budget. A whole of country approach means that all institutions work together. They talk with each other. They collaborate with each other. Yes. So that's the kind of, I would say, multifaceted or multi-tiered or multi-stakeholder intervention strategy that we have to take on board if we're going to get serious when it comes to tackling crime.